Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk. So, let's talk the miracle of the seventh day ox. Today, we are going to be reading chapter 6, 7, 8, possibly 9. We will see how it goes. Thank you again for being a part of the Let's Talk family. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell notification button for all my future videos. That way that you will get notified. Also, please comment, like, and share. I appreciate that. It helps with the algorithm when you do that. And I hope that you are so far enjoying this book. It's going to get even better. I am just so excited to read this. So let's just jump right into chapter 6. Miracle of the Seventh Day Ox, Chapter 6, narrated by Stefanie Pettis. Near midnight, Nikolai finally laid on his bunk, his feet hanging over the end of his bed. Unable to sleep, his mind raced at the strangeness of his new surroundings. Again, Nikolai was overcome with the remoteness of the place and the very simplicity of the camp. There were no prison walls, no barbed wire, no guard towers. The guards didn't even carry guns. The very nature of such a prison defied all logic of what could and should be expected in the place. There was obviously a chain of command from the top on down, as Nikolai was soon to learn. The warden oversaw the prison camp and reported to the government officials higher up. Below him were the immediate officers in charge of the various functions of the camp. There were 4 junior officers. One was in charge of the guards, and therefore indirectly the prisoners. A second was in charge of work detail units, and so it went. And prisoners also answered to the pecking order of sorts among their own ranks. Those who had been at the prison camp the longest appeared to have seniority, but not always. If a man was big enough, strong enough, or intimidating enough, he could gain power and prestige among the other prisoners. But no matter the status of the prisoner, escape was out of the question. Nikolai was sure of that. Even in warm weather, to attempt such a thing seemed utterly foolish. Food, for starters, would be a problem, even if one could evade the guards, who would no doubt be sent out as a posse. How much food would one have to carry in order to survive the march to civilization hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away? Nikolai knew that wild creatures lived on the open plains, but he had seen very few of them. Reindeer herds ranged the open country, and he observed while on the moving train, but Nikolai doubted that a lone man on foot with no weapons would be able to catch a reindeer, no matter how desperately he tried. Of course, there was the tundra wolves, Arctic hares, snowy owls, and many types of lemons and mice he had been told lived in these parts, but all of them were considered unclean according to biblical standards. Nikolai knew that even if he could catch them, he would never be able to bring himself to eat that kind of meat, no matter how hungry he might be. The idea of escape was ludicrous at best. And what was the point anyway? They were all in this remote location together, warden, camp officers, guards, and prisoners. In order to survive the harshness of such an environment, each must do his part, even if there was a pecking order. They needed each other. And that would have been enough for now. It was all he could hope for. Here he was in this remote spot in the world, and there was no one he knew. No one to care what happened to him. There was no one, it seemed, to whom he could speak of loneliness. His fellow prisoners would have to be his confidants and cronies. They would have to be his friends. But even so, as he tossed and turned, trying to fall asleep, his mind began to panic and scream at the protest. How did I get myself into this? Please, Lord. He heard himself begging in whispered tones. I prayed that my time here will not be in vain. May you use me to speak to other prisoners. May they see Jesus in me. If I can bring the gospel to them and let them see Jesus in me, that would be worth the pain and disappointment of having to be here. Let me be a witness to the guards, Lord. Though they mistreat me, let me bear their insults and abuse. You did without complaining. Let them see that I am different, that the peace of heaven is on my face. And the warden? He's a Russian officer schooled in the ways of military. In his world there is no God. Please, Lord, make him know beyond a shadow of a doubt that you exist. If I can be that person to help me see you and your saving grace, I would be honored and willing to do that. Nikolai began to feel the sweet peace of heaven settle over him. His prayer in the prison cell and on the train over had been that God would be able to use him wherever he happened to be, wherever God could use his service. Lord, help me keep my courage and let me be faithful to you in the church that I love, he breathed. I stand. Here he quoted the famous words from the book he loved. I can do no other. May God help me. Amen. Somewhere in the twilight of the midnight sun, Nikolai finally slept, and then it was morning. Chapter 7. Nikolai sat bolt up on the wooden boards of the bed where he lay sleeping. He tried to clear the fog from his tired mind to make sense of his strange surroundings. Where was he? What was he doing here? On your feet, men! We don't have all day to lie around spinning dreams. There's work to be done. On your feet! Nikolai heard a crash and then a groan just a few feet away. He turned on his bed to see a pile of boards from one of the bunks and a man underneath them. Above him towered a guard, with shafts of dusty morning sunlight streaming through the open doorway behind him. Now Nikolai remembered where he was. The guard strode to where Nikolai was lying, but Nikolai scrambled to his feet to the attention before the guard could take a swipe at him too. That's better, growled the guard, in what Nikolai imagined must be a tone of satisfaction. You've got 30 seconds to line up in front of the cabin. Better yet, let's see you make it in 20. Without a second thought, Nikolai dashed out into the early morning sun, now already well above the northeastern horizon. Even so, the hour was still early. Nikolai figured it couldn't be more than 5 or 5:30 in the morning. He squinted at the brightness of the sun and wondered how the sun could rise so early this far north. But of course, with the tilt of the Earth's axis during the summer months, places this far had more daylight than cities farther south, such as Moscow or Kiev. When the guard came out of the barracks, Nikolai was still trying to button his shirt and straighten his trousers. It was good that he had boots to wear and not shoes to lace up, or he wouldn't have made it out of the courtyard this fast with all his clothes on. Nikolai glanced down at his appearance. It was true that his clothes weren't on completely straight, and his shirt wasn't buttoned up all the way, but he was relieved to know that he had somehow managed to straighten himself up in a few seconds the guard allowed them. Again, Nikolai tried to shake the fog from his eyes and mind. There was no way to escape this reality of his surroundings. He was in prison camp somewhere in Siberia at the end of a long train ride from the west. And one thing was for sure, if he was going to survive this place of desolation at the ends of the earth, he was going to have to learn to get up on time. Actually getting up well before was what was called would be better. This was his first morning in camp, and it seemed that he was expected to know everything about the rules and regulations of the place. But Nikolai was quickly learning that one rule seemed to overshadow all others: never be late. He struggled to think positive thoughts as he stood at the attention in the row of the prisoners lined up in front of the barracks. The idea of having to do this every morning for the next 5 years, 10 years, or however long it took the KGB authorities to figure out they had punished him enough was almost more than he could bear. "For being late, you boys can skip breakfast this morning," the guard barked. "That'll teach you to sleep in." No one moved. "Well, what are you waiting for?" he growled. "You have work details. Get your assignments. You three," he suddenly added, pointing at Nikolai and the other 2 new prisoners. "The warden wants to see you immediately." The 3 of them looked down at one another with raised eyebrows, but when the guard turned and walked away, they shrugged and simply headed for the administration building. Nikolai thought it was strange that the men in his barracks had been caught sleeping in. Weren't they used to camp life? And weren't they used to getting up this early every morning, or was that just a show of the force for Nikolai and the other new prisoners? And why weren't he and the other prisoners being escorted to the warden's quarters? The whole thing seemed kind of strange. But then Nikolai remembered how informal the place was. People were just expected to go about their business and do their jobs, he guessed. Nikolai was the last of the 3 to be called into the warden's office. As he stood at attention outside in the hallway, he wondered what went on inside these kind of prisons. What should he expect? Would he be interrogated again? Would he be mistreated because he was a Christian? When Nikolai finally stood in the warden's office, he was surprised at how simple the place appeared. Though the warden was a colonel in the Russian army, there was almost nothing in his office to dress it up. A medium-sized oak desk, 3 chairs, a lone kerosene lamp, and a few books on a dusty bookshelf. After studying an official letter that had been sent him via the mailbag of the train, the warden cleared his throat. "You had a run-in with the KGB." Nikolai waited and said nothing, since the warden's statement was more of a commentary than anything. "Nikolai Panchuk." The warden put an official letter back in a folder in his desk. "I've got no use for preachers. As far as I'm concerned, you preachers are all just a bunch of rebels." The warden brought his fist down on the desk with a bang. "You think you can change the world?" he growled. "Well, I've got news for you. The motherland is fine the way she is. The Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics is the greatest nation the world has ever known. She doesn't need any help." The warden squinted at Nikolai through slit eyes. "Do you understand that, Panchuk?" "Yes, sir." Even though Nikolai was a Christian and didn't agree with the tactics of the government used, he was still proud to be a citizen of the Soviet Union. It made his chest swell just to hear the national anthem or to see athletes competing for the glory of the nation. The officer leaned back in his chair. "I'll tell you what, Panchuk," he seemed to cool a bit. "Let's forget about what it was that got you here in the first place. If you follow my orders in this camp, I'll not give you any trouble. We'll let bygones be bygones. What do you say to that?" The warden began sorting through some other papers on his desk. Nikolai wondered whether the warden fully understood the charges being brought against him. He had to, didn't he? The man had Nikolai's file. Did he know about the secret churches? Would he be expecting Nikolai to give him the list of church members? Of course, Nikolai knew he would never give such a list to the warden, not even if the warden should beat him, not even if the warden should kill him. But of course the warden didn't know that. Nikolai wondered if he should just bring up the subject and get it out in the open now. On the other hand, maybe he should just let the warden figure it out for himself. "I want to cooperate, sir." Nikolai's face was solid as he stood at attention and stared straight ahead. The warden stood to his feet suddenly. "Good, Nikolai, I'm glad to hear that." A slight grin edged over the corners of his mouth. "Now, I'm sending you to the wood shop. You'll be working with Vadim, the camp carpenter. Lots of work to do around there," he announced. "And remember, Panchuk," he added as he pointed the way for Nikolai, "follow orders, and you and I will get along just fine." Chapter 8. Nikolai couldn't believe his ears. That was it? No interrogation? No grilling to get long sought after information from the preacher? This was too good to be true. It couldn't be that easy, and Nikolai was sure there would be some future confrontations. As he turned to go, Nikolai suddenly remembered his biggest problem of all, the Sabbath. He would be required to work during Sabbath hours. That's what happened when you were a prisoner. Nikolai wondered, should he say something about it now or wait until Saturday, when the Sabbath would actually become an issue? Nikolai knew he'd better take care of it immediately while he was still standing and had the courage and the warden's attention. "Sir," Nikolai stopped and turned around. "There is one thing that may be a problem." But already the warden had moved on to other things. "Remember, Panchuk, no problem. Simply obey orders and you and I will get along fine." And with that, the warden waved him out the door. Nikolai stood a few minutes longer, wondering what he should do. But when he realized that there was no use in pressing the issue now, the warden was in no mood to listen, and maybe it wasn't the right time for such a discussion anyway. God had his own timetable as to when these things would take place and should be taken care of. Nikolai mused. He knew he'd better let God work everything out as he saw best. "Help me know when that time is," he silently prayed. Nikolai went looking for Vadim, the camp carpenter, and found him in the wood shop. Vadim still had the pungent odor of garlic on his breath, and the smell of it made Nikolai ravenous. Garlic was one of his favorite foods, and knowing that he had been deprived of breakfast made it twice as hard to work and wait for that midday meal. But Vadim had plenty for Nikolai to do, and that made him almost forget the grumbling, growling feeling in his stomach. The mess hall needed more wooden benches made. Then there would be a few boards in the floor of the administrative headquarters that needed to be replaced, and a door at the mess hall needed mending. Lunch finally came. It was a simple one, but Nikolai didn't care. He was just glad to get something warm into his stomach. The cook had made broche with beets, onions, and cabbage in it. It was the most heavenly food Nikolai could remember tasting, and the Russian Blackbeard tasted like cake, and Nikolai, after his 2 days on the train with so little to eat that afternoon, Vadim told Nikolai they needed to repair some of the large wood water barrels sitting near the kitchen. Each barrel held about 50 gallons of water and was made with oak staves. Nikolai had to tip them on their side to roll them back to the wood shop where Vadim would be making the repairs. On his trip back for the second barrel, Nikolai noticed that an ox cart had pulled up at the kitchen. The cart held 2 laden wood barrels filled with water, hauled from a spring located more than a half a mile, 1 kilometer away. Oleg, the driver of the ox cart, was shouting at the ox, trying to get him to pull the cart forward a bit more so the water could be hauled inside the kitchen. But the ox wouldn't budge a step further. Maybe the ox was tired from hauling the water, and maybe he was just being plain stubborn, or maybe he was weary of the treatment he had been receiving from the driver. At any rate, it was obviously a showdown, and it seemed both the driver and the ox were determined to win. When the driver pulled out his leather prod and began to whip the ox in the face, Nikolai sprang into action. He knew it probably wasn't wise to get involved since this was only the first day in camp, but he couldn't bear to see the animal being mistreated. "Hold on," he called out to the driver. "It's obviously the ox is too stubborn for his own good. Why don't you try something else?" Nikolai tried not to look at the driver. He was butting in where he might not be wanted, but he felt he had to try. "What's his name?" Nikolai asked nonchalantly as he stepped up to the ox and gave the animal a pat on his thick, muscled neck. "Maxim." "I guess," the prisoner replied. "I never used that name, but I guess it's his name." "Animals are like people," Nikolai said. "They like to be convinced to do something, not beaten into submission." Nikolai patted the ox's neck again and leaned forward to whisper something into its ear. Then he took hold of the halter around the ox's neck and pulled forward as he continued talking to the ox. The technique did the trick. In a matter of seconds, the ox had pulled the cart a short distance forward so the driver could unload the barrels and put them on pallets outside of the kitchen. That night, after the evening meal, Nikolai went to the stables, where he found Maxim quietly munching on tundra marsh grass. Nikolai sat down beside the big animal and watched him eat. He felt sorry for him. In some ways, he thought he understood how Maxim must feel. The ox's job was to work every day, day in and day out, week after week, with no break. That seemed to be his only purpose in life. And he was a prisoner like Nikolai. He was not his own boss. He couldn't come and go as he pleased. His job was to haul water from the spring, and it probably would be until the day he died. After that first evening visit with Maxim, Nikolai stopped by the stables every night to bring the ox a little something from the kitchen. Sometimes it was a beet or a wedge of cabbage. Sometimes it was just a small carrot. But it was the talks he had with Maxim that helped Nikolai feel the most. Nikolai was sure that he was getting much more from the visits than Maxim was. But the animal seemed to enjoy the company. The one-sided conversations helped Nikolai deal with the pain of being so far from home. When he felt he was going to panic from the loneliness that threatened to overwhelm him, old Maxim would look at him with his big brown eyes and just listen. And so, a relationship began to grow between Nikolai and Maxim. It was a wonderful tonic for Nikolai's spirit, and it helped him deal with this discouragement of those first few days in camp. Chapter 9. As the weeks progressed, Nikolai knew that the Sabbath problem wasn't going to go away. He was going to have to face it. Several times he wondered how he should break this news to the warden. But there seemed to be no good way to do it, and no good time either. The warden kept to himself and didn't invite many visitors into his office. One thing was for sure. He had Nikolai's file in his office, and sooner or later it would be probably used against him. The Sabbath day hadn't been a specific problem on Nikolai's record. The thing that had gotten him in trouble had been his unwillingness to cooperate with the KGB and give them a list of his church members. But would the Sabbath be a problem now? Nikolai could hardly imagine that it wouldn't, since the warden had reminded him that obeying the camp rules was extremely important, and Nikolai hadn't heard that there were any days for rest or recreation. As Thursday and Friday came, Nikolai knew a showdown was imminent. On Sabbath morning, long before the roosters were crowing over the chicken coops, Nikolai was up, restless and waiting for the will of God to be revealed. "What is it you have in store for me?" Nikolai whispered as he knelt in the early morning shadows of the sod barracks. "I know you want me to be your witness, and I know I may have to suffer for your sake. But how am I to know what your plan is for me?" But the voice of God was strangely silent, and Nikolai knew that this was one of those times he would simply have to wait for God to lead. When he heard the other prisoners in the barracks begin to stir, he knew the time was fast approaching, and since God had not told him what to do, Nikolai made a decision. He would go out to roll call, but not to breakfast or his work assignment. After roll call, he would return to the barracks and fast and pray. Come what may, this was the decision he would have to stick by. And that was it. It was though God had been waiting for Nikolai to make a decision about the Sabbath and act on it. It was this moment of decision that gave Nikolai the confidence he had been lacking all week. Suddenly he could see things clearly, as though a window of opportunity had opened. He was standing on the threshold of another great moment in his life. He sensed that things were going to be very hard for him now that he had made this decision, but he wanted to go through with it anyway. After roll call, he did exactly as he had planned. He returned to the barracks, knelt down again on the hard dirt floor by his bunk, and began to pray. And every moment that passed took him closer to the inevitable confrontation he knew that was coming. But it didn't come as soon as he had expected, and he should have guessed as much. No one would know that he hadn't shown up for his work assignment except for Vadim, and the carpenter might simply think that Nikolai had been asked to work somewhere else for the day. But finally, the moment of truth arrived. About mid-morning, Nikolai heard one of the guards outside talking to another prisoner. "Where's Panchuk?" the gravelly voice demanded. "I haven't seen him," came the reply. It was almost noon before Nikolai was finally discovered in the barracks, and when he was, it seemed the whole world was caving in. "What are you doing in here?" the guard demanded. "Are you sick?" Nikolai knew that if he said he was sick, they might let him off the day, but that wouldn't fix the problem. The following week, he would be in the barracks again, and the likelihood of his being sick 2 Sabbaths in a row would certainly be cause for suspicion. Nikolai knew he needed to deal with the Sabbath issue now. He needed to face this problem head on, no matter what the consequences. It was the only way. "I'm not sick," Nikolai said plainly, getting to his feet. "Then why are you in here?" the guard asked incredulously, as though expecting some sort of ridiculous answer. And he got one. "I can't work today because it's the seventh-day Sabbath of the Lord my God." "The 7th day what?" the guard yelled, standing in shock still. "The 7th day is God's holy Sabbath, and I'm forbidden to work on it. The Bible is." "The Bible?" Nikolai was cut short by the guard. It was obvious the guard hadn't seen this coming, and gave Nikolai a chance to take the explanation a bit further. "The Bible is God's holy word, and in it he tells me I should worship him on the 7th-day Sabbath in honor of his world's creation." Nikolai would have liked to have said more, but he knew the guard would never let him finish, and he was right. "I don't know what you're talking about," the guard interrupted again, finally getting his bearings. "It doesn't matter what the day is. We work every day around here. On your feet, Panchuk. I won't have any slackers in these barracks." But Nikolai made no move to go, and this infuriated the guard even more. "I'll teach you to disobey orders," he shouted again, his face turning purple with rage. He pulled a nightstick from his belt and began to beat Nikolai on the head and shoulders. Nikolai didn't have time to do anything but cover his head, and with his hands and arms it hurt, but he was able to deflect the worst blows of the beating. "Now get to your work assignment," the guard shouted. "Vadim is looking for you." Both Nikolai and the guard were breathing hard by now, but Nikolai still made no move to go. "I'm sorry, but I can't work." Nikolai repeated the words quietly. "It is forbidden for me on God's holy day." At this, the guard let loose with a steady stream of curses and began to beat Nikolai mercilessly with his fists. Then he grabbed Nikolai by his shirt collar and dragged him out of the door into the barracks courtyard. By now the commotion was so great that the other prisoners were looking toward them to see what all the noise was about. "We'll see about this 7-day holy Sabbath of yours," he shouted uncontrollably. "We'll just take you to the warden and see what he says about all this. He'll know what to do with the likes of you."